I'm going to talk to you about accounting. Well, there's some accountants in the audience. It's good. And you can't get away either. Now, and it's not just any form of accounting either. It's an obscure branch of accounting that deals with intangible assets. Those are assets that are not physical in nature. But I think what you'll find is, well, I hope what you'll find is over this time that you'll find that these assets are in fact very real and they affect the lives of every single person in this room every day. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of the speech, you'll find they're a little bit interesting. So let's kick off. So, if we go back to 1975, intangible assets accounted for barely 17% of full company value. You fast forward to today, it's 90%. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about very large companies, the top 5 companies by market cap, the intangible asset value is about 98.2%. If we look at most startups, it's about 99%. And so, if you really think about it, 90% of all the value of all the companies you see is now in these intangible assets. And so what's really happened is that over the last 45 years, we've gone from assets like these to assets like these. Confidential information, patents, designs, regulatory approvals, systems and processes, data, software code, regulatory approvals. To give you 2 quick examples, there's 110 million lines of code in the average new car today. Right? And recently we worked with a very large mall owner. And in the process of working with them, what we discovered is that the value of the data coming off their malls is more valuable than the malls themselves. Now, these assets are not just where the value is, but they're where all the revenue and the profit is generated today as well. And there's a really simple thought experiment you can do to prove this. Imagine I gave you something really heavy and tangible, a really heavy and tangible industry like a steel mill. I gave you a free steel mill. But the catch is I get to keep all of the intangible assets. So I get to keep the software that runs the mill. I get to keep all of the industrial know-how. I get to keep the regulatory approvals that enable you to run that mill. I get to keep all of the knowledge, the relationships, the customer-supplier relationships, etc. What becomes apparent very, very quickly is that whatever your accountant tells you, that mill is not an asset. It is, in fact, a liability. The real value in the mill is the ability to run it safely and efficiently, and all of that is contained inside those intangible assets. Now, for me, the poster child for this is this company here. So this is Instagram. This is Instagram on the day it was sold to Facebook for $1 billion. That is all of the staff of Instagram on the day it was sold to Facebook, right? And on that day, it had basically no revenue, no what you'd conventionally call assets, that many staff, and it was about 20 months old. Now, you might say, well, maybe Mark Zuckerberg overpaid. Zuckerberg, whatever you might say about him, is no idiot. The research shows very clearly that Facebook made at least 7 times its money on the purchase of Instagram, and if Instagram is a separate business unit, it'd be worth about $100 billion. Now, on the same day, it was worth about the same as this company here, which obviously had a little bit more in the way of revenue, a little bit more in the way of assets, a few more staff, and had been around for a little bit longer. And the question is, how is that possible? Because under any kind of conventional financial analysis, how can it be that a company with no revenue, no assets, no staff, no track record can be worth the same as one that has all of those things in abundance? And the answer is actually surprisingly simple, but actually quite profound at the same time. And that is tangible assets, things that when you drop them on your foot hurt, right? They cannot scale at exponential growth rates. Whereas intangible, they grow like that. That's how intangible assets grow. That's how tangible assets grow. Intangible assets can. Because what we're actually dealing with is not economics or accounting per se. We're dealing with the fundamental stuff of the universe. The chairs that you're sitting on, we can't take one of those and suddenly make it 1,000,000 times bigger in a month. But with intangible assets, you can. So if you think about a TikTok video, it can go viral and have millions of people watching it within a couple of days. The Beatles would record a song, and it could be available to millions of people instantly, and it gets played billions of times. And I'll give you just one little example of this. So, If we consider agriculture versus semiconductors, between 1970 and 2020, global agricultural production increased by about 40%, which we're going to have a bit of a problem, actually, in terms of the amount of agricultural production. We need more, right? But semiconductors over that same period increased by 5 billion%, the power of semiconductors, right? In other words, there's no Moore's law for agriculture. Agricultural production doesn't double every 18 months. There's a limit to the amount that you can squeeze from grass or trees or grain or cows. And that limit is fundamentally set by the speed at which the planet goes round the sun. And that's really problematic for economies that are based around, for example, primary assets, because it presents a real sustainability issue that we have to deal with. And for economies that aren't based like that, they tend to grow much quicker and therefore can fund education, healthcare, etc. Now, what we find when this comes to the value of companies is basically the more intangible you become, the faster you can grow. This is the number of years it took a variety of different companies to reach $1 billion in market cap. And what you basically see is that if you build your business around intangible assets, you can grow faster because capital rewards growth, capital chases growth. So if you can grow faster, you're worth more. And you can build a bigger business, employ more people, etc. Now, despite everything I've just said, this is what most companies are doing. That is a real photo, by the way. That is not a faked photo, right? Most companies are focused on fixed assets, those big, heavy, tangible things. And many businesses run around, they assiduously track chairs and laptops and company cars and plant and equipment. And there's two fundamental reasons why we are looking the wrong way. The first is humans just have an innate cognitive bias that 2.5 million years of human evolution taught us you don't get killed by an imaginary tiger, you get killed by a real one. And so we just prefer physical objects. Now, the second reason comes down to the accountants, fundamentally, because the accounting standards were designed for an industrial age economy, when things were about plant and equipment and inventory and so forth. And if we look at how accounting standards treat intangible assets, what we find is that they're either completely off balance sheet, they simply don't make the balance sheet at all, or they go under this amorphous term goodwill, because we don't know what otherwise to call them, and it had to be, bad will sounded bad, so we called it goodwill. Or we put it under cost, and cost is in fact the worst of the three. And the reason why cost is bad is that there's no correlation between cost and value with intangible assets. What I mean by that is that we come back to the chairs, right? There is a definitive relationship between the input value to the chairs that you're sitting on and their actual value. The amount of plastic and material and metal, etc., those chairs are never going to be worth $1 billion. But with intangible assets, there is no correlation between their cost and their value. So putting things on the balance sheet at cost is a really bad idea. Now, and I'm going to give you an example of how bad this can be. And I promise, this is the only balance sheet I'm going to put up. Right? Now, this is Nortel Networks. Nortel Networks was once the darling of the Canadian Stock Exchange. It was worth 1/3 of the entire exchange at one point. And it went bankrupt. And the investment bank managing the transaction sold off all the fixed assets and business units, and they netted themselves $3.2 billion. The last asset to be sold were some patents. Now, patents, in a quirk of accounting, do make the balance sheet, and they're on the balance sheet here. You can see them for $31 million. Most people thought they weren't worth anything. The highest market estimate of their value was $1 billion, and most people thought that was a crazy valuation. Well, ultimately, actually, the patents ended up being sold for $4.5 billion, 145 times what they're on the balance sheet for. In fact, the patents ended up being worth more than the entire rest of the company, 1.5 times combined, which really begs the question of, did this company need to go into bankruptcy in the first place? Right? So as we can tell, the balance sheet, BS, yeah, it stands for BS at times, right? Now, for those who are interested in economics and running businesses, sometimes people say, well, maybe the P&L is a little bit more honest, the profit and loss statement. So I want you to imagine two companies, right? And they both start out with $10 million, and they both want to be able to produce product X. That's their goal. And what company A does is it says, look, I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend my $10 million on R&D, and that's going to enable me to produce product X. Company B says, I'm going to take my $10 million and I'm going to buy R&D, I'm going to go and buy intangible assets, or I might buy a company that owns intangible assets so that I can make product X. Now, they both end in the same place. They've alienated $10 million away from themselves, and they both can now produce product X. But let's look at how it turns up in the accounts. Because in the case of Company A, that's most likely to show as an expense in the P&L, which depresses earnings, makes it look like the company is making a loss. In the case of Company B, that's most likely to show as an asset in the balance sheet, enhancing company value. Now, Company A looks like, from an investment perspective, it's underperforming relative to B, but it's not. It's identical. Now, I haven't made that up, by the way. That is a real example, right? Now, this guy here, Warren Buffett, he knows a little bit about business, and he talks about the fact that accounting is the language of business. And if anybody's read George Orwell's 1984, we'll tell you language is incredibly powerful. And the problem is that that accounting language is broken, right? The accounting standards, they drive company reporting, the way that companies think and report on themselves. And that in turn drives three key things. It drives capital flows. So for example, that's how, for example, investors look at your business if you're trying to raise money, or it's also how the bank thinks about you when they want to loan money. So for example, if you're a small business and you go to the bank and you want to borrow, you have to put your house up as collateral. Despite the fact that 90% of your value is going to be in your intangible assets, they're interested in your dirt, right? The least scalable asset of all. If we think about regulatory approvals, because those company reports drive the regulatory approvals, in particular, they drive tax. 60% of all international trade is actually in intra-company transfer pricing arrangements. What do I mean by that? I mean, it is large companies moving money around the world to avoid tax. And they do it by utilizing intangible assets because they can't move their factories. Right? And finally, it influences management behavior. And what I mean by that is, imagine you're CEO of those two companies, A and B, and you want a bonus. What are you going to do? You're going to do the R&D that makes your company look like it's making a loss? Or are you going to go on an M&A spending spree? So it influences how management behaves as well. Now, up to this point, you might be thinking, well, okay, this is more interesting than I thought. but really, who cares? I mean, this doesn't affect me day to day. I'm not a CEO. I don't work for the tax department, thank God. Why should I care? Well, I'm going to give you 91 trillion reasons why you should care. Because that's the value of the global economy. And virtually all of it is now based around intangible assets. Every investment, every loan, every tax payment, every company, every job is influenced by the things that I've been talking about. The very things that are not being adequately described because the language is broken. It was built for an industrial age, but we live in an age that looks like this. It's very, very different. So what now? What do we do now? Well, we can't do this. This is not a sane reaction to anything at all, right? So there's a couple of things we can do. Number one, we need to recognize that the topology of value and growth and risk has fundamentally shifted in the economy. But it's not reflected in the accounts. And unfortunately, these guys, the accountants, they're not changing anytime soon, right? Because it would impact absolutely everything. And I'll give you a very small example. You know the QWERTY keyboard, the keyboard we all type on? The reason why it's arranged that way is to slow down typing. Because when they were first designed on typewriters, if you type too quick, the little hammers all got fouled up, right? And so everybody learned to type on this keyboard that was designed to slow it down. Now imagine if you took everybody's keyboards away and rearranged them to be more efficient. Would we actually be more efficient? No, not for a very long time. And that's the same problem with the accounting standards. Everything would have to change. So what do you do then when you're dealing with a language that's fundamentally broken? Well, as organizations what we need to do is the following. We need to identify and recognize that these intangible assets exist and identify them. We need to manage risks to them and better protect them. Because if anybody of you who's here go to MBA school, they always talk about there's options when you're a CEO is to buy or build. There's 3 options, actually not 2. It's not buy or build, it's buy, build, or steal. And steal is actually the cheapest option of the lot, especially when it comes to intangible assets. Third, we need to value them, because right now they're not valued. And when you don't value them, it's like walking into a store and there's no price tags on anything. It's really hard to engage with the merchandise. And then finally, once you do that, you can unlock value, and it means you're no longer as reliant on your fixed assets or your tangible assets. And I'll give you one little story about that. So we worked with a company that was being sold. It was quite a large company too. And the investment banks managing the transaction said it was worth 4 times EBITDA, or 4 times profit is another way of thinking about it. It's surprising how often it's 4. It's like that's the only number on their calculator. These guys get paid a lot of money. And so we got involved and we said, well, actually, hold on, the most valuable asset in this business is actually the data. And that data is completely off balance sheet. And so we started to talk about the data and we protected it. So we managed the risks around it. And then we valued it appropriately. And then we went into a process of unlocking the value. And fundamentally what we did is we talked a lot about data and why data was important and valuable. And number 2, we targeted companies who wanted to buy data, not who wanted to buy an operating business. And the reason why is that the people who wanted to buy data had a much bigger checkbook. And we sold that business for 32 times EBITDA. Right? 8 times the money that gets recycled back into the economy in New Zealand, etc. Right? So, in case you think, well, this is kind of all interesting, the final point I'd really make is that this is a trend that is not going back. Right? This is not like a pendulum that it's going to swing one direction, then it's going to swing back. It's not like bell bottoms where you can stuff them away in your closet and then 20 years later you can bring them back out again. Right? This is baked into the cake. And so hopefully this hasn't been quite as boring as you feared, and that you've seen that intangible assets today are in fact among the most real and the most valuable and perhaps the most interesting of all assets. Thank you.